The blood froze before it touched the snow. A young man was dragging himself across a Montana field in the worst blizzard in 40 years, one arm useless against his chest, one leg trailing behind him like something that no longer belonged to him. Half a mile back, his pickup lay upside down in the ditch with the wheels still turning. He had no voice left to call out with. The only light in all that white screaming dark was a single yellow bulb burning over a barn door he was certain he would never reach. Earl Whitaker was 61 years old that night, and he heard his old dog go rigid at the kitchen window before he understood why. He went out into the storm in his bare forearms and his work boots and found a boy in a soldier's haircut bleeding into the drifts, gray-lipped, barely conscious, gripping Earl's wrist with a strength that didn't match the rest of him and saying the same 3 words over and over. No hospital. No call. Earl had been an army medic in another war, in another cold place, a long time ago, and he knew that particular fear in a man's eyes. He carried the boy into the barn, laid him on the workbench under the lamp, and went to work with the only hands the kid would let near him. He worked until dawn. And when the gray light finally came up over the eastern ridge, the workbench was empty, the blood already drying, and the boy was gone, out into a world that had swallowed him whole. Earl never learned his name. He told no one, not in 10 years. He assumed he would go to his grave not knowing who he had pulled out of that snow. He was wrong about that. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this one travels tonight. Senior Chief Petty Officer Lucas Reed, United States Navy, retired, had been looking for a barn he could not name in a county he could not remember for the better part of 3 years. He was 43 years old now, and he carried himself the way men do when they have finally stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. He was 6'1", lean through the chest and heavy through the shoulders, with dark hair cut short and going to iron at the sides, and a 4-day shadow he didn't bother to fight in winter. There was a thin white scar that ran from beneath his right ear down along the line of his jaw, old and faded, the kind of mark a man stops seeing in the mirror. His eyes were a pale, level gray, the eyes of someone who had spent 20 years learning to read a room before he entered it and had never quite learned how to stop. Not cold eyes, still ones. The eyes of a man who had looked at very bad things and refused to look away, and had made a kind of uneasy peace with the looking. He had done 4 deployments before a career's worth of damage finally caught up with his spine. Ramadi when he was young and certain of everything, then the Helmand River Valley twice, then 1 rotation in a place he had signed papers agreeing never to name. He came home from the last one with a chest full of ribbons he kept in a drawer, a fused vertebra, and a quiet he had never figured out how to fill. But the thing that had brought him back to Montana in the dead of winter wasn't any of that. It was a debt. A decade ago, between his 2nd and 3rd deployments, a younger and more reckless Lucas Reed had rolled a truck on black ice on a back road in this valley during a whiteout, crawled through a field toward a single light, and woken up the next morning in a roadside motel 40 miles away, with stitches he had not put in himself and no memory of who had saved his life. By the time his head cleared, the storm had rewritten every landmark for 100 miles. He had been looking for the man with the lamp ever since. Diesel rode in the passenger seat the way he rode everywhere, upright and watchful, eyes forward on the road. He was a 6-year-old German shepherd, 84 pounds of black and tan muscle, his coat thick enough that snow gathered on his back without melting through to the skin. A piece of shrapnel had taken a notch out of his right ear during a compound clearance overseas, and the scar had healed into something that looked almost deliberate, like a stripe of rank. He moved with the clean, controlled confidence of an animal that had learned the difference between noise and threat a long time ago. He did not react to sounds. He reacted to meaning. Lucas had spent 8 months fighting the kennel paperwork to bring him home, and in all the years since, Diesel had never once gone still over something that turned out to be nothing. The valley opened up below the highway in a long white sweep, fence lines drawn like stitching across the snow, a scatter of farms with their chimneys smoking against a flat pewter sky. Marlow, Montana, population not quite 800, sat at the bottom of it where 2 county roads crossed. The cold came through the truck's glass like something with intention. It smelled of wood smoke and diesel and the particular iron tang of deep winter, and under it all was a silence so complete that Lucas could hear his own pulse when he cut the engine. The kind of quiet that doesn't exist in cities anymore, the kind a man either learns to live inside or learns to fear. The man who was eating that valley alive went by Preston Vance. He had come up from Denver 4 years earlier with a development company, a smile that never reached above his cheekbones, and a plan to turn the whole basin into a luxury resort corridor, golf, second homes, an airstrip. He had bought up 11 of the valley's working farms already, most of them from families who never quite understood how they'd ended up signing until the checks had cleared and the equipment was gone. He owned the county commissioner's re-election campaign and a controlling note at the Marlow Bank. And the one time a rancher had tried to organize the holdouts, the man had found his grazing permits revoked and his loans called inside of a month. Vance liked to say, to anyone who pushed back, that he wasn't in the business of taking land. He was in the business of waiting. "Everybody sells eventually," he told a county meeting once, leaning back with his hands folded. "Some folks just need a little more weather first." He said it smiling. Nobody in that room laughed. The last holdout was a 71-year-old farmer named Earl Whitaker, and his 160 acres sat dead center in the basin, the keystone parcel without which the whole development couldn't close. Earl still rose before light and worked his place with hands that had buried his wife under the cottonwood 11 autumns back. He was a Vietnam veteran who had carried a medic's bag through the Ia Drang and never once mentioned it. He didn't complain. He paid what he owed and asked for nothing. When the town saw him at the feed store, he was upright and clear-eyed and unfailingly polite. A tall, narrow man in a canvas coat who held the door for whoever came behind him. What the town didn't see was the stack of notices on his kitchen table, a back tax assessment that had tripled overnight, a lien filed against a barn he'd built with his own hands, a foreclosure date circled in a banker's red ink. Earl had stopped sleeping. He had not stopped standing up straight. He had decided, privately, that they would have to carry him off the place because his wife was buried in that ground and he was not leaving her alone with strangers. Lucas met him by accident, the way the important things tend to happen. He had pulled into the gravel lot of the Marlow diner to thaw out and feed the dog. And through the window he saw 2 men in good coats crowding an old farmer up against the bed of a truck. One of them had a clipboard. The other had his hand flat on the old man's chest. Not striking, just pressing, herding him backward the way you'd move livestock. The old man wasn't backing down. He was telling them, in a voice too low to carry, to get their hands off him. Nobody else in the lot moved. A woman loading groceries looked away. Lucas was out of his truck before he had decided to be, and Diesel was out the door at his left knee, low and quiet, ears forward. Lucas crossed the gravel without hurrying, because hurrying changes a scene before you understand it, and stopped 6 feet from the men. "Everything all right here?" he said. It was not a question. The man with the clipboard turned, took in the worn coat and the gray at Lucas's temples, and dismissed him in half a second. "Private matter, friend. Move along." The other one didn't take his hand off Earl's chest. That was when Diesel walked past Lucas's leg, crossed the open gravel, and sat down deliberately at Earl Whitaker's side. Pressed against the old man's hip, facing the two men, calm as a closed door. Earl looked down at the dog, and something in his face moved that he didn't let the men see. Lucas saw it. He had learned over a great many years that the dog knew the measure of a man faster and more honestly than he ever could. And Diesel had just cast his vote. "Take your hand off him," Lucas said. The man laughed, but he took his hand off. They left with a clipboard and a parting line about deadlines and county process, climbed into the truck, and pulled out spraying gravel. Earl Whitaker stood very straight in the cold and looked at the stranger and the dog who had stepped between him and the thing that was eating his life, and said only, "Wasn't your business." And Lucas, who could not yet have explained why, said, "It is now." It became his business fast. Over coffee that Earl didn't want and drank anyway. The story came out in pieces. The tax that had quadrupled the same week Vance's surveyors appeared. The lien on a barn that had been paid off for 30 years. The foreclosure sale set for the end of the month. Lucas listened the way he'd been trained to listen, saying little. And the more he heard, the more it stopped sounding like bad luck and started sounding like a campaign. He made a call that afternoon to a man he'd served with who now worked white-collar fraud for a federal field office 2 states over. And he learned within a day that Vance's company was already a quiet name in an open file. 3 other counties. The same pattern, the same manufactured liens, against elderly and veteran landowners who didn't have the money to fight in court. An old rancher named Sutter, who'd lost his own place to Vance 2 years back and had been drinking about it ever since, came and sat at Earl's table and told them everything he'd seen. Diesel lay across the kitchen doorway through all of it, head up, eyes moving from face to face. And twice, when Vance's name was spoken aloud, a low sound came up out of his chest that wasn't quite a growl and was somehow worse than one. Lucas didn't say much, but he took a legal pad and a pen and he started writing dates down. And Earl, watching him, understood that the man across his table had done this kind of work before. Then the weather Vance had promised arrived. 3 days before the foreclosure sale, a county judge, the same judge whose campaign Vance had funded, denied Earl's emergency motion to halt it, and the bank posted the notice on the barn door in the gray morning light. Earl read it standing in the snow with his hat in his hands. He didn't say anything. He had survived a war and the loss of his wife and 40 winters in that valley. And Lucas watched something in the old man finally bend under the weight of being told, by a piece of paper nailed to wood he had cut and raised himself, that none of it had ever really been his. Earl walked into the barn and sat down on an overturned bucket beside the old workbench and put his face in his hands. Diesel crossed the cold floor and laid his head against the old man's knee and held it there, unmoving, the way the dog did only when someone was in a kind of pain that had no answer. Lucas stood in the doorway and did not break and did not speak. He had already decided what he was going to do. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. It was in that barn, in that silence, that the truth finally came up out of 10 buried years. Lucas had stepped to the workbench to lay his hand on it, an old habit of grounding himself, and the cold from a fall the day before had cracked open the half-healed skin along his right forearm. Earl looked up from the bucket and saw the wound, and then saw the old scar above it. The faded line that ran up under Lucas's rolled sleeve toward the elbow, and the old man went absolutely still. He stood. He took Lucas's arm in both of his hands, the way a doctor takes an arm, and he turned it to the light, and he traced the puckered line of that decade-old scar with a thumb that had grown unsteady with age. "I know this stitch," Earl said quietly. His voice had changed entirely. "I made it. Right here, on this bench, in a storm." He looked up into the stranger's gray eyes and found, 10 years late, the boy who had gripped his wrist and begged him not to call anyone. "It was you." Neither man said anything for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the snow. Diesel rose to his feet and stood between them, looking up. And then he did something he had never done in front of a stranger. He leaned the whole weight of his body against Earl Whitaker's leg and stayed there. Peace, when it came first to the dog. The morning of the sale, the bank's people and the county's people gathered in Earl's yard with the foreclosure paperwork, and Preston Vance came too, in a long charcoal coat, smiling, to watch the last farm in the valley fall into his hands. There was a small crowd, neighbors who had lost their own land, a deputy, the woman from the diner, old Sutter with his hat off. Vance was telling someone about the clubhouse he planned for the South 40 when Diesel walked out of the barn, crossed the frozen yard, and lay down flat in the snow directly between Preston Vance and the porch where Earl stood, and would not move. The yard went quiet. The dog did not growl. He simply lay there, a line drawn in the snow, his amber eyes fixed on Vance, and the message required no translation at all. Vance looked at the dog and, for the first time in 4 years in that valley, didn't seem entirely certain of the ground under his feet. Lucas Reed stepped down off the porch. "Before this goes any further," he said, and his voice was not loud, "you should know who you've been doing business with." He gave them his name, his rank, 20 years in naval special warfare, 4 deployments, the decorations he never displayed. Said it flat and complete, the way a man reads coordinates, and watched the assumption drain out of the faces in that yard. Then he turned to Vance and spoke to him directly, without heat, which was far more frightening than any amount of shouting would have been. He laid it out in order. The quadrupled assessment, the fraudulent lien on a barn paid off 3 decades ago, the judge whose campaign Vance had financed, the 3 other counties. He named the federal field office. He named the open file. He said that a forensic accountant had been through the bank's records for 6 days and that the agents were, at that moment, 40 minutes out. He gave Vance exactly one thing, the chance to stop the sale and walk to his car before they arrived. And he gave it without any expectation that the man would take it. Vance did what men like Vance always do. His smile held for a moment, then cracked into something uglier. "You have no idea who I am in this state," he said. "You have no idea what I can do to a washed-up sailor and a senile old man." Lucas didn't answer that. He'd learned a long time ago that the cheapest thing in the world is a threat from a man who has just understood he's lost. He simply looked at Vance and let the silence do the work, and the silence was total. And into it came the sound of tires on the frozen county road. They were not local. 2 dark SUVs, a state vehicle behind them, and a woman in a federal windbreaker who walked into Earl Whitaker's yard with a folder and asked, clearly, for Preston Vance by name. What happened next happened in front of every person Vance had spent 4 years intimidating. The neighbors he'd squeezed, the families he'd broken. Old Sutter standing there with his hat in his hands and tears on his face. There were no theatrics. There rarely are. A few quiet questions, a hand on an elbow. A man who owned half a valley folding down into the back seat of a government car, with the door closing on him, like the lid of something. Lucas watched it without satisfaction. He didn't say a word, and he didn't smile, because there was nothing in it to smile about. Only a thing that had been wrong for a long time, finally being set right. That restraint, the not gloating, was the last and truest thing about him, and the people in that yard would remember it longer than they remembered the arrest. By the following summer, the valley had changed its weather for good. The federal case unwound Vance's company thread by thread. He was indicted on 14 counts of fraud and conspiracy across 4 counties. The development collapsed under its own liens, and the families who could prove what had been taken began, slowly, to get pieces of it back. The corrupt judge resigned before the bar could move on him. The fraudulent assessment against Earl's land was vacated. The lien on the barn struck, the foreclosure void, and the deed to 160 acres in the center of the basin stayed exactly where it had been for 50 years in the name of Earl Whitaker, free and clear. On a warm gold evening in July, Earl sat on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched Diesel tear across the south pasture after a meadowlark he had no hope of catching, barking with the pure, stupid joy of a creature that has decided the world is safe. Lucas Reed sat in the other chair. He had stopped looking for the barn because he had found it, and he had found the man. And somewhere in the finding, he had stopped feeling like he was passing through a place on his way to nowhere. He'd bought the failing farm next door at the auction for back taxes and had spent the spring putting it right. The cottonwood threw a long shadow toward the house where Earl's wife was buried, and the old man and the younger one sat in it and didn't feel any particular need to talk. The boy who had crawled through the snow had come back. The medic who had saved him hadn't had to wait alone after all. The dog ran in the last of the light, and the valley held its breath, and everything that needed to be set right had been. Sometimes the things that save us don't announce themselves. Sometimes a miracle is a single yellow bulb over a barn door in the worst storm of a man's life, and a pair of old hands that ask for no name and expect no thanks. Sometimes the bread we cast on the water comes back to us across 10 silent years, in the shape of a stranger who turns out to be the one we once carried out of the cold. God does not always settle our debts on the schedule we'd choose, but He keeps a longer account than we do, and He has a way of placing the right person at the right gate at the exact hour someone faithful is about to be carried off the only ground he ever loved. No kindness is ever truly lost. It only waits for its season. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the good they do in the dark is never wasted. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, has a stranger's kindness ever come back to you when you least expected it? Your story might be the light someone else needs tonight. And if you believe in stories of loyalty, faith, and debts repaid across the years, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, keep watch over every veteran who ever sat alone in the cold, and remind you always, the kindness you give in silence is never truly forgotten.